Welcome to the Managing Violence podcast, the internet's leading free resource on violence prevention, threat assessment, personal security and self-protection, brought to you by R2S Violence Prevention. We are #ForTheProtectors. I'm your host, Joe Saunders. Welcome everybody to episode number 101. I'm joined today by Kerry Murakami, a very experienced law enforcement defensive tactics instructor, as well as a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and all-round very impressive martial artist. Kerry's also been a friend and supporter of the show for quite a long time and understands what we do and understands the mission of the show. And it was a real pleasure to enjoy a conversation with him. Also, just a reminder, my tour of the UK is coming up. At the time of this episode going live, we're about 6.5 weeks away from the tour in the UK. So make sure you check that out at violencepod.com/UK tour. All right, let's get straight into the interview with Mr. Kerry Murakami. We're talking law enforcement defensive tactics training. I'm joined here on the Managing Violence podcast by Kerry Kato Murakami. Kerry, thank you for joining us on the show.
Joe, thanks for having me.
Kerry's been a long-time listener and supporter of the show, and it's an incredible martial artist and a former law enforcement officer, retired after 28 years of service in the state of Illinois. Has run combatives clubs, has run defensive tactics training, is a very well-regarded defensive tactics expert, and has also run scenario-based training. So Kerry is not just a fan of the show, but also a legitimate expert, and it's great to have him on the show. So Kerry, for your, I guess for the sake of introduction, can you give us just a little bit of a snapshot about your career from, I guess, law enforcement, and then what led you into martial arts and wanting to, I guess, explore this world of defensive tactics and scenario training? Sure.
So I just retired out of a north suburb of Chicago with 28 years. During my 28 years, I was a defensive tactics instructor, firearms instructor, scenario-based training instructor. I was an FTO, but that was kind of short-lived. I've done and had my hands into all levels of training. And as far as martial arts goes, actually, to go back to my law enforcement career, the last, say, 10 years or so, I've really started to create a lot of content, and most of that being from the combative sports. And then, so now to go back to my martial arts career, really, my parents couldn't really afford martial arts as a child. So, I had some friends that did judo, and, we'd play around. And, of course, I was a huge fan of pro wrestling, and we would, launch each other off of the back of sofas and whatnot. And but it wasn't until probably like early 90s, probably about late 80s, I started Aikido. And at a certain point, I just was like, yeah, this isn't for me. And then I started my law enforcement career. To go back into law enforcement, I went to a pretty much an entry level defensive tactics course in the mid 90s. And, I was pretty skeptical then and still skeptical now. And then finally found Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in 2000, where I pretty much focused on, and eventually got my black belt a couple years ago.
Yeah, I have to ask, just because I'm sure you know this about me as well, but who was your favorite pro wrestler growing up?
Only because of the name Kerry Von Erich. I didn't really have a favorite per se. It was just entertainment, really. It was just fun to watch, and
the spectacle of it all.
Yeah. And then of course, trying to recreate what you saw on TV off the back of the couch with your friends. And then, some of the minor injuries and, concussions.
Kids don't try this at home. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, yeah.
I always make the connection with pro wrestling that it's kind of like if you're a kid watching pro wrestling, then it's like superhero comic books, but in real life, and it's sort of like with a this isn't just a cartoon. This is actually happening, and you can kind of suspend your disbelief, or yeah, if you're a kid, maybe you don't even realize. But yeah, I grew up on that stuff, and funnily enough, it was pro wrestling that led me into martial arts as well because I wanted to be a pro wrestler when I was 5 years old, and no one was teaching cage matches for kids at the time, so I had to do taekwondo instead. But
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
I grew up at a church basically that offered judo, and I would watch and be in awe, and uh, just to see some of these high level throws and the impacts that they caused, and was that was thrilling for me. But yeah, I eventually got into martial arts, but not until I was an adult.
yeah, yeah. Very cool, man. So there's a bunch of topics that we can talk about, but I know one thing that you're really passionate about, and it's something that we haven't spoken about at length on the show for a while, and that is how do we go about getting more law enforcement officers to actually train? Right? We a lot of us in this field know that there is I guess a lack of skill or a lack of I won't say a lack of dedication because I think that's got a value attached to it, but there's certainly a lack of appreciation for the importance of ongoing training from a lot of law enforcement officers. Obviously, there are those that do go out and train multiple times a week, but how do we go about changing that culture, or do you think that culture needs to change? Let's start there.
Yeah, to start, for sure, the culture needs to change, and I think there are some organizations here who are really starting to push, especially jiu-jitsu for law enforcement. Invictus is huge, Blue Line BJJ, and I think it's the need for change is 100%. Um, I I see the changes, and it's a slow process. But uh, just like anything in law enforcement or anything in government, it's going to be slow. Um, I'm working with a insurance company, a risk management agency that covers a lot of agencies here in the Chicagoland area, and they see the value of jujitsu, or combative sports, but they're still hesitant because of basically the number one uh, threat for every DT program is injury.
Yeah, of course.
So, um, yeah, I think I'm a big proponent of training on your own time and dime, and how that's going to really change. Yeah, I think that's time will tell, really.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, I think, because I've heard just like you, I'm sure, like well, if the department or the agency wants me to train, they need to pay me for it, right? Or that like I'm not taking more time away from my kids to do something for work, which to me always felt really like why are you here? Like what are you actually trying to achieve with your job? If you're just collecting a paycheck, sure, but even if you are just collecting a paycheck, then surely you want to do that safer. Surely you want to do that without the threat of going to jail or losing your career because you didn't know what to do in a situation and you overreacted or you underreacted and ended up seriously injured. Like it always sort of rubbed me the wrong way that people are like, well, I'm not going to prepare myself or look after myself unless I'm paid to do it. But I do get it from guys that are and girls that are overworked and don't think they can make the time to do it. From your experience, like talking about individual officers, those that have started training later on in life, or perhaps they're mid career, they've suddenly taken an interest. What's sort of been the turning point for them? Like, has it been a bad experience, or like, what's your experience with that?
Well, I mean, I'll speak for sure just for myself. In law enforcement, actually in life, but I've never wanted to be the what I call the lowest common denominator, and I feel like I didn't want to let my partners down or my coworkers down. So I was always pushing myself to try and be better. And in some things, it took a lot longer than others. Um, as far as other officers, I can speak for sure for a handful that I know. A lot of it was, here at my old agency, because I basically ran training. I could put guys into scenarios, and essentially essentially like a positional sparring drill, right? I can put you in the bottom of side control and say, hey, you got a minute to get to escape. And when 97% cannot escape, actually probably closer to 99% of the people couldn't escape, you know, I'd say a handful of them had the epiphany that they were like, man, maybe this is something I should work on. So, so they began to start training jujitsu and took things a little more seriously. Um, but we trained a lot more than a lot of other departments, so it was pretty easy to do. As far as outside agencies, now here at the gym I train at, man, we have 5 cops that off the top of my head, there are all black belts. And they work for actually, was it four or five? They all work for Chicago, and we probably have another 20 or 30, and they're and more and more are joining. So they're starting, the word's starting to get out, and they're starting to show up to the gym, and train. And that's all we can do. I think, I think the time's coming. I think, it's especially here in Chicago with the way things are going, they have zero issues of going after cops. So if you screw up, they're looking for you, and they're going to come hard at you. So to me, even if you just train twice a week for an hour a crack, it's better than nothing.
Yeah, and I think certainly for officers that are training on their own dime, it's there's probably very few systems that have the bang for buck, but also the lower chance of sustaining injury and so on as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does. I mean, we talked briefly about judo, and I'm a judo guy and I love judo, but it's not something that's very kind on your body, especially if you're picking it up in your 30s or 40s. Whereas
Right.
jiu-jitsu it tends to be something you can pace. Not to say that there's not really bad injuries that come from jiu-jitsu from time to time, but it tends to be when you get a little bit too ambitious, and you think you're going to be Gordon Ryan overnight, and you end up pulling a Hartlage. But
Right.
it's becomes a bit of an issue. But I think it is something that people can take up. It's readily accessible now. It's become more affordable than what it was. And I remember even when I was bouncing in nightclubs, it was such a pleasure when you bump into someone that you're working with that happened to be a blue belt. You're like, oh my god, we're like superheroes now. We've got someone who knows what they're doing. It's gonna be great.
Yeah.
And you look back on that and you go, oh, well, that blue belt really didn't know much, but compared to the average person, that was a huge amount of knowledge.
Yeah,
Um,
I would take somebody who knows a little bit of something versus somebody who knows nothing.
yeah, or someone who thinks they know something, which is
Pretty
the other
dangerous.
challenge. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, I'll come back to that in just a minute, but I want to just ask you what's your perception on the issue with people thinking that you see sometimes big guys like, I don't need to train, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm whatever, right? I don't need to learn that martial arts stuff because like I'm big and strong. Or alternatively, people that are a little bit too tool reliant, like the sprays, the batons, the cuffs, the guns, like they don't see a need for the empty hands. Is that attitude changing, do you think, from your conversations and interactions?
Um, I'm trying to get that point across. I say it in all my classes that the only tool that's on your belt, at least the typical cop's belt, the only tool that's on your belt that you would use in body contact would be handcuffs. I said everything else has an appropriate distance, and that distance is usually not body contact. Now, can you use a baton at body contact? Yes, but that's not the optimal range. Can you use a taser at body contact? Yes, but even taser says that's not the optimal range. Can you shoot people at body contact? Yes, but that's not the optimal range. So, you know, trying to get that across to people when I say it like that, people, you know, every student I've had kind of like, huh, yeah, you're right. And I think that's really where the isolation training, you know, you need to, you can't, well, yes, you need to train if it's taser, you know, whatever, however much time you dedicate that to, then, you know, that's going to be an isolated block. Same with, you know, pepper spray or whatever it is you're doing. But then that's where my old agency, we would incorporate, you know, in scenarios where, you know, we would give you all these tools, and it's up to you to figure out which tool is appropriate or which tool is not appropriate. And then, and work around, you know, hey, I'm too close. Oh, I can't use this. You know, it's just a hand-to-hand scenario. So, I think ranges and tools are tools are necessary. Just like, you know, if you're a carpenter, you're going to use tools for the appropriate job. I think the biggest issue is we've been forced. I guess the law enforcement culture has been forcing tasers down our throats and is the end all be all. So, you know, that's just why guys are in body contact and they have zero hand-to-hand skills, and they whip out this taser that is ineffective at that distance. So, you know, I'm trying to get across that, but I've still met, you know, a handful of people who are like, I've never needed this before. I work with some different agencies, and, you know, they've never had a need for any of this, and why would we need this now? And I'm like, hey, the world's changing, you know, and for sure, cops hate change, and they're going to be the slowest to come around. So I do see some changes. You know, things are going along, and but it's going to be slow.
I'm interested in your thoughts. We a little while ago, probably about a year ago, I interviewed Luis Gutierrez from ISR Matrix,
Sure.
and we're talking about the application for jiu-jitsu for law enforcement then. And he raised an interesting point about, I think at the time it was very topical about we should be mandating that every law enforcement officer has a blue belt, right? I think that was the conversation point that was going around. And he raised an interesting point, like, well, where do you find enough instructors around the world who are going to teach the same system to the same standard to make everybody a blue belt, and for that to actually mean anything? Because, you know, as soon as something becomes mandatory, the standard is going to drop, right? So that we can get we can make sure that every officer becomes a blue belt within 6 weeks, right? We know that's going to happen as soon as something gets mandated, and everyone teaches jiu-jitsu slightly differently, so you end up with a there's probably not going to be a system that is going to be universal. So you're still going to end up with issues where I'm sure it'll be a net positive that everyone's got some training, but you're still going to end up with, you know, discrepancies between how good one department is versus another department based upon their instructor and their style, and whether that instructor has any relevant connection to the realities of law enforcement and the types of situations that you're actually preparing people for. So he raised a point about how do you scale that appropriately, and his argument was that we should be looking at more of a jiu-jitsu or grappling based system that is more standardized, that is very specific for law enforcement, so that we can remove the things that aren't necessary, or that, you know, like, you know, arm barring someone who is not going to tap out and who's going to break their arm doesn't necessarily achieve anything. But certainly be able to put someone to sleep or be able to have positional control and be able to, take the back and be able to, get hands behind the back, that absolutely has merit. Uh, what do you see as the way forward for more incorporation of jiu-jitsu? Is it just encouraging the sporting participation to get people actually moving and learning some skills? Do you think there's room for I guess a law enforcement jiu-jitsu curriculum that could eventually be widespread? Like, how do you see it playing out in the future?
Okay, so I guess there's a couple of things there. So I I think Lewis says he's on point there. I think Chad Lyman's got a really good program with C4C, and I think, but the biggest issue is like any cop, like once he gets to that blue belt, he'll stop. Right, like just
Yep.
just like when
Yeah.
your average blue belt gets promoted, right? What happens? He
Yep.
just
Yep.
disappears. Um, and we all know that. Okay, yeah, he's got a little bit of skill, but in a year from now, that skill will diminish. I wouldn't say it perishes, but I would say it diminishes. And then what happens? 3 years, 5 years, and at a certain point, you know, you know, I would say it's akin to riding a bike. You'll never forget, but you just lost all that timing, right? And in timing is that's, I mean, think about like how many times you get to whatever. Let's just say in a sportive context, how many times you get to a triangle choke, right? And but your timing's literally just a hair off, and you can't finish it. Um,
Yeah.
uh, so timing is everything. So if you're not consistently and frequently training, then you could have your blue belt and it really won't matter. So,
Yeah.
um, so I think there's a, you know, yeah, yeah, I think mandatory training is a must, obviously, because we have to have certain skills and certain check the box items covered. But you know, having the ability to train on your own time and dime, um, even like we discussed before we started the club aspect. Having some preset times where we can meet and toss ideas together or debrief a call or and just maybe maybe the blue belt took a year off and now he needs a refresher. Hey, I had this opportunity to hit this one move and I couldn't get it, blah blah blah, and you bring him back on the mats and maybe reinvigorate him to get back on the mats. But yeah, I think it's I think at a certain level the blue belt's great, but you know um I mean you know when we set the bar at blue belt, I mean, why are we setting the bar so low?
Mm.
you know I mean, I get the concept, right? I get where we're going, but why are we just saying get to blue belt and then we stop? you
Yeah. Or
know
it should just be you continually train for your entire
right,
career, basically.
right.
Yeah.
For your
What?
entire career, you need to continually and frequently train so that you're proficient at certain levels. And obviously, at the beginning of your career, you're not going to be as good as towards the end of your career. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously the training evolves, right, as you get older, and
right,
most people throughout their career will eventually end up in less conflict rich environments. They might move into more administrative or supervisory functions or something, but it doesn't mean you don't need to have those skills as sharp as they possibly can be, because that one time you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place at the wrong time.
right,
Then you're preparing for that time when when you're really unlucky, and just assuming you're not going to be unlucky at some point is a really bad strategy.
right.
Um, I just want to pull on that sporting club aspect a little bit, because one thing I've noticed in probably the last 5 years, especially, but it's started a little bit earlier than that. We're seeing even corporations like big corporates that are having jujitsu classes or martial arts classes like on site in the break room, maybe not the break room, like in the gymnasium or something on site, as sort of a almost like a perk of employment. Like you get a gi upon sign up, and you can go from software development to go do an afternoon or a lunchtime jiu-jitsu class, right? As just like this perk of employment. And it just feels to me like, why is that not something that we're doing for law enforcement, especially where it doesn't have to be like all the rigmarole of mandatory training, which people tend to dread, but hey, like, why not? If we've got a basement, why don't we have a jiu-jitsu club that runs classes at the end of regular shift times, so that even just from a stress management point of view, like guys have a rough shift, they don't want to go straight home to their family, rather than going and sinking 14 beers before they go face the wife and kids. Like, go sweat it out, dude. Go train, and to your point, you could possibly work through a scenario that you just had that's still in your head, that is stressing you out or making you unhappy about how it played out. It's like, we've got guys on the mat right now. Let's go get a sweat on and figure this stuff out. Like, it just feels like it's so much healthier and beneficial. And if guys don't have that and they don't want to drill work stuff, they can just roll and have fun.
Yeah. The, so the culture really stems at culture. Here, we still have law enforcement agencies who, in their policies, tell their officers they cannot train, combatives, or seek outside training or use tactics and techniques outside of their agency, which is so archaic. But that's still going on here in 2021. And unfortunately, the people who are making these decisions, they probably haven't seen the streets in decades. They really don't have a clue what's going on out on the streets. And those are our decision makers. Each individual officer is going to have to figure out, what they're going to do. But, your administrators aren't going to step up for you when you're the one getting sued. So I think you got to seek your own training. That's my 2 cents on that, as far as but it stems at culture. I mean, you can easily change the culture. It's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of effort, and people just need to see sweaty dudes rolling around, and next thing you know, you'll get a knock on the door. Hey, can I jump in?
Yeah,
you'd be surprised. You just got to start doing it. You can't you can't procrastinate. You can't wait for other people to, you can't wait on them. You just got to go and do it.
Yeah, I think to your point there about culture change takes time, right? It's something that we talk about a lot with professionally with Risk to Solution, like when we do risk culture projects, or whether it's violence prevention or whether it's anything else, is that turning people around and turning around a culture is like turning around an aircraft carrier. Like, it's going to be incremental changes over a long period of time. And if you look at it and go, well, I'm going to implement this in the next 3 months, like, well, good luck. You're going to be really disappointed, because you're going to feel like you put a lot of effort in and you haven't achieved anything. And right. But really what you've done is that, it's going to take a lot of effort to get started, because you are fighting the inertia of the current culture. And it is going to be disappointing, because you're not going to get as much buy-in as you want, or you're not going to get the funding or the whatever you need to make it happen. But if you've started, as long as you can keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing, like, it might be a 5-year project that you look back and go, Wow. Okay. Look at where we are now compared to when we started, and maybe those changes were yeah, were difficult to see at the time, but we've actually made a difference. And sometimes the brutal honesty of changing culture is sometimes you just have to wait for people to retire, right? Sometimes you just have to wait. You have to outlast the people that are the blockages. Uh,
That
I,
that for sure is the truth. Um,
yeah.
the best part for me in the last well, I would say the last 5 years, I was the old guy on the department. I was the most experienced on the department. So, you know, there was zero. When they said, "Oh, I'm too old to do that," there weren't many guys who were older than me who could say that. Um, and they would be like, "Yeah, I don't need this. I've never needed it before." I'm like, "Oh, that's odd because I used it, however many years ago."
Yeah.
So when the old guy is the instructor and he's making the push, it makes it a little bit easier. But you still got the young guys who think they're young, and have all that energy, and then you have the kind of that mid range, and that just over the rookie, 5 to 10 year mark. They think they know it all because they've seen it all.
Mhm.
um, and then you have the 10 to 20 year guys who are, well, 10 years and above. They're probably the hardest to change. um,
Mhm. They've hit their cruising altitude. It's
right,
like this
right,
this this
right.
is where we're staying now. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think, as far as like, to kind of create that change, and this is just what I do with my business. And when I consult, first I just try to tell the agency that you're looking at like a 3 to 5 year, uh you know project here, and because it's going to take 3 to 5 years for you to really start seeing a lot of change. And then what I've noticed is, and what I push is, my 2 officer tactics. And basically, with that, once they start implementing it, they start saying, hey, this actually worked. It's simple, it's effective. Um, and then they start seeking out a little bit more, like, hey, what else you got? Like, because that stuff really worked. And you get some buy-in, and in the buy-in, you'd be surprised. And again, like when I talked to the guys, I said the guys who really need to buy in are the senior guys, the guys who have 20 years plus, because they've already started their countdown calendars. I know that. I mean, I did it. And I want to know that everybody I work with, we're on the same page, so that when we hit the ground, we're not, and it's not the traditional polyester pylon. So the buy-in comes in from the senior guys, and it makes things easier to make change. Um, you start teaching some fancy guard pass, or you were to add in something, I don't know. Let's just say like a mounted armbar to handcuffing.
Mhm.
Like, one, why are you teaching that? Two, um, the chance of you hitting that with the amount of institutionalized training time that's offered, it's not going to happen, right? So um, you have to start slow, and you have to start with effective uh, tactics and techniques, and that's, to me, where you get the buy-in. And I've seen the buy-in at all levels. So um, that's the mainstay of my business. And I see change through that. And we'll see where the future what the future brings.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Like you have to be realistic about the time frames, and you have to be realistic about what you're going to teach and what the reception is going to be, and make sure you're teaching based upon what people actually need, as opposed to what you find entertaining. Right? Sometimes as instructors, you're like, I'm really bored of teaching this stuff, and I want to just do something different, but that's not what your student needs. So that's a challenge for instructors of all disciplines, I think. Um,
Sure.
I just want to, before we run out of time, to mention it. We've talked a lot about jiu-jitsu, and I think a lot of people probably have a very sort of strict understanding of what jiu-jitsu is based upon the sport, based upon perhaps what they see in MMA, or like, you know, those that have only sort of watched guys in gis doing ground fighting. I know you're also a scenario-based training instructor. So how do you go about incorporating scenarios into your defensive tactics training? And obviously being well aware that, you know, we're not fighting in gis, we're fighting with belts and vests and accoutrements and boots and all those kinds of things that are going to make a lot of jiu-jitsu not exactly the way the way we'd like it to work. So how do you go about incorporating those realities and scenarios into your training?
So I am a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, but if you look at the kanji for Jiu-Jitsu, right? And people define it as like the gentle art and whatnot. But if you actually change the first kanji, Ju, you can change it with a different kanji that also is pronounced Ju, and that kanji is gun. So my definition of jujitsu is just the art of strategy, and it goes from 1 inch to 100 yards or beyond, right? And so we need to win at all those ranges. So my definition straight up is just a little bit different. And I believe, as much as I love jujitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, I think wrestling, any form of striking is super important. So, all those combative sports are trained at my old agency, and including pistol and rifle. So when we now I'll talk about how we incorporate that into scenarios. We try to incorporate all aspects of those fields into our scenarios. Obviously, you got to take into account also law and policy and whatnot. But those aside, the last few years, what we've been doing is training quarterly. So we would pick a topic, and that might be room entries. And so it might be it would be a 2-person room entry, but 1 student and 1 role player. And then we might have some bad guys in the room. And so, we would, the topic would be room entries. And, for the most part, all our guys kind of knew how to do the room entries. We had a tactic that we used, and, we would give them a problem to solve once they got into the room. And sometimes the room would be empty. There's really nothing to solve. Maybe as they exited that room to go do another room entry, they'd stumble across a problem. And that problem would be, depending on the scenario, it might be a body contact scenario. It might be at distance. It might be somebody who's compliant or completely non-compliant, or somebody who's actively trying to assault us with either their hands or a weapon. And, the biggest thing we try to get out of scenario-based training was, problem solving. So it just kind of depended. Some focus, which was actually probably my favorite, was confined spaces, and problem solving in confined spaces. It just, things are a lot different. When we train on flat ranges, there's always the ability to move laterally, diagonally, straight backwards, which I don't really train, and I don't really agree with. There's very little times where you need to move straight backwards. with the exception of maybe like a hallway, but anyways, but when you're in confined spaces, which every home has, and I argue with people all the time, they're like, "Oh, we don't need to train in confined spaces." I go, so you basically have all your calls in an empty parking lot. That's not the case. I can count 2 incidences that I had in essentially a vacant parking lot, but there were cars around. There were a couple cars around. So, when 99.9% of your calls are in confined spaces, that's really where we should be training. So, yeah, that's those were interesting training sessions, and I think my guys really started to understand how to deal with stress, how to make decisions under stress, and when necessary, the physical hand-to-hand component came in, where there was a high need for that.
Mm-hmm. I really like your to go back to what you said at the start there about your jiu-jitsu being the art of problem solving, because it's I think it was Paul Sharp said when I interviewed him that his jiu-jitsu is everything from harsh words to hand grenades.
Right.
And
Right.
I've stolen that phrase a few times
Sure.
since then. But it's amazing when you start unpacking the principles of jiu-jitsu, or even judo, because I mean the principles of the two are very similar.
Very.
But when you start unpacking those, you can apply them to all different areas of life. Like one of my favorite sales books actually unpacks the principles of jiu-jitsu as applied to how do you convince someone to buy something, right? And
Right.
that's something that I think all police or anyone in enforcement or regulatory compliance role should be doing, is figuring out how to sell people stuff, because really what you're doing is you're selling them a course of action. You're selling them compliance, or you're selling them like this idea that hey, this is in your best interest right now. Don't make me go any further than this. But that was all jujitsu, right? And
Right.
to your point about scenario training, and to me, like when I teach, we've only got a handful of clients that really want us to go deep into defensive tactics and physical training. But there's no way that we're ever going to have enough time to be able to give you a solid drilled answer to every possible scenario that you're going to face, because just reality is there's going to be something that's different to what you expected. There's going to be a different environment. It's going to be a different combination of factors. It's going to be a different demographic. There's going to be all sorts of things. So the best thing we can do is give you a couple of reliable tools, and then give you the ability to dynamically risk assess, to be able to solve problems, to be able to improvise, to be able to figure out how that concept would apply in this situation. Like, it's not about giving you a technique for every scenario, because it's just not going to be possible. But if you can make better decisions under stress, and you can be more fluid in how you think and see how something might apply, that's when you get the real bang for your buck, I guess, out of your training. But it's a lot harder than just here's a technique, do it 5 times, and let's move on. Yeah, I don't think there's a short way of delivering that training. we can get started, but it does take a bit of practice and a commitment to wanting to learn it.
Correct. I think I make fun of you said five reps and we're done, right? And
Yeah.
I make fun of I call this character 1 rep max, and is because he's the guy who says, "Oh, I did it once and I got it," and I'm like,
Yeah.
we all know you don't got it,
Yeah.
because you put him under pressure and he just crumbles. And I'm not a PowerPoint guy, but I got a slide in my PowerPoint with captioned 1 rep max, and there's a guy who's bench pressing, and you could tell he's failing on this bench press, and the plates are starting to slide off, and I go, don't be 1 rep max, because you'll fail under pressure.
Yeah. Nice.
And and it's, you get to a certain point, and most, at least when I was training my agency, is you'd call that guy out, and he would know what he was doing, because I would just make fun of him. But yeah, I mean, every student's a little different. Sometimes you got to coach people through things a little bit more. Sometimes you got to make fun of them. Sometimes, you know, uh, you just got to judge your own student there. But yeah, I as far as dealing with students like that, it's difficult. But I always try to put out right out at the beginning of class that you don't want to be this guy, because everybody looks around the room, and then you're the only dude who's not sweating. And and when they're sweating and everybody else is sweating, and you're the only dude who's like playing on your phone, answering calls, answering text messages, running in and out, doing one rep, coming back in, like we all know you're the lowest common denominator. So don't be that guy. And it's, I like putting it out there right in advance, because then, they kind of know that I'm watching you just like you're watching me, and everybody else is watching you too.
Yeah, I like that. I like that strategy. It's almost like you're pre-shaming.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
I was like, I'm gonna call this out so that everyone else notices as well. Right. So you don't think you're under the radar anymore. I like that. Hey, Kerry, I know you've got your own business now, Rectitude Training. If people want to know more about you, or they want to book you, like where do they find out more about Rectitude Training?
Rectitudetraining.com, Rectitude Training LLC on social media platforms. Pretty easy to get a hold of. Yeah, just reach out.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, man. I know you're going to stick around and do some bonus content, but for those that'll leave you here, thank you very much.
Awesome, Joe.
Thank you once again to Mr. Kerry Murakami from Rectitude Training. Make sure you reach out to Kerry if you're interested in any of his offerings or anything he had to say. It's always a pleasure to talk to a law enforcement officer, and especially an experienced veteran with real context for the needs of the law enforcement community. All right, if you've enjoyed this show, I would encourage you to please join the Facebook group, the Managing Violence Tribe on Facebook. The link will be in the show notes. And also, if you really enjoy the show and you want to contribute to the show and support the show, then go to patreon.com/managing violence, where you can contribute and get bonus content for this episode and all future episodes as well. That's it for me today. I look forward to speaking to you next time.